or the reader sublime or the luster, which to some extent I think one even saw Whitman literalizing a bit last week, and Stevens was desperate but very powerful in the end successful quest for a self-reliance or originality. Is to some extent overdetermined by, again, but I want to look at that in particular in a short poem called The Poems of Our Climate, to which we'll give most of our time today. I'm not quite sure how to proceed. I think maybe we will begin with that and then contrast it with something which is going on in the two closing sections, my song myself, since it's really the coda for Whitman's poem, which we haven't touched on at all. The future stance of it, the stance it takes towards the future, which is finally, I think, its greatest strength, which is not available to Stevens. But I think really also as an exercise in reading, because there is no single shorter poem by Stevens that I return to so often. What is the page reference on this? Poem not as well known as it should be, very subtle, as you'll see, written in 1938 when the poet was 59, moving towards his final period, but not yet at it. It's on page 158 of this little book, The Poem at the End of the Mind. If you have some other edition of Stevens, I can't give you the page reference. But since we have had to move in a course which has been necessarily, and it makes me at times uneasy, more conceptual than it is focusing on image or figuration. And since I think I'm happiest and most myself when I'm reading a poem very slowly, I'd like to take this single short poem by Stevens and unearth in it a phrase he never uses, but which is of course used throughout the supreme fiction, this notion of finding a first idea, trying to reach originality by the reduction of what he calls a first idea, and even if that is not wholly elucidated today, since it's an enormous attempt to circumvent what I've been calling practicity. We will come on to it next time in relation to the text of notes. Discovering that you cannot live with a first idea, which is what I think the poem The Snowman is most truly demonstrating. And then finding that almost the redefinition of the poem has to be, as it were, any single first idea or reduction plus its reimagining and placing them together. I want to use as an instance, however abstract that sounds, and I use abstract really in this Givensian sense of something withdrawn from a stale covering and therefore refresh itself a first idea. First means, I think I remarked in my book on Stevens, the etymology of the phrase is very elucidatory of what is involved in it. First means earliest. That's the etymological or original meaning in English. Idea, of course, goes back to a root meaning, seeing. So to have a first idea is to see something, whether it be object or something difficult, or an object taken up in the mind as though no one had ever seen it before you, which is of course impossible, particularly in language. But it's of course the Emersonian quest, the Whitmanian quest, that is the quest that Stevens inherited. In some curious sense, that is at the basis of this extraordinary poem called The Poems of Our Climate, that before getting started with it, and as I say, I want us to use this as the kind of exercise in close reading, that except for certain specific biblical passages or Freudian passages, we haven't been doing, and never with the kind of aesthetic concern that one has to use now. This, after all, is a lyric poem. Behind it is the history of what you can call the irregular ode as a form in English. It is perfectly clear what the parent poem is. In fact, I can ask you that by asking you what is the inevitable, though I do not know and cannot know by the nature of things whether this is a deliberate allusion or a complex and partly unconscious echo, though I suspect it is deliberate allusion. what is the reference that in spite of ourselves perhaps we hear when we reach the second part of that first stanza? The day itself is simplified, a ball of white, cold, a cold porcelain. That cold, a cold porcelain evokes what? Enormously famous English poem. It has got to be the Grecian urn, overwhelmingly. It was that particular moment in the Grecian urn which has always reverberated longest in interpretive and poetic tradition. Thou, silent form, doth tease us out of thought, as doth eternity. And then suddenly the poet cries aloud. And obviously cold porcelain, but the reference is the same, because pastoral there is indeed a metonymy for the actual Grecian urn, and porcelain here again refers to an urn or bowl. Well, this is part of a flower arrangement, and with that finally, what we go into the whole question, what this lyric is doing, perhaps in some sense, even though I want this to be, ongoing as preparation for a consideration of Stevens next week in the light of what he calls the first idea, the enormous struggle or agon in him against an overwhelming bapticity, which is what we have been concerned with all along. I'd be willing to call this class for the next hour and 45 minutes or so a kind of class on how to read a poem, and not just this particular poem by Stevens. And therefore, one looks first at what it is in genre. It is a poem, as its allusiveness would make clear, very much in the tradition of that kind of apparently self-contained English lyric, of which the Ode on a Grecian Urn has always been taken as a kind of model, a kind of perfection. But of course, there is an American difference from the start. Poems of Our Climate is a curiously American title. Let me read the poem, not as really it should be read, to, as it were, put it on the table before all of us, and then let me ask a series of questions about it as we work through it, at least on a first level. Even before I read it out loud, there's this to be considered about it from the start, and this is, I think, the great value of Stevens as a poet, as a kind of lyric experience. He is about as subtle and nuanced a poet as I think the 20th century has given us. It is hard to believe that you could be more subtle and nuanced even than Valerie or Rilke or Yeats in a different mode, but I think one can make that claim, that assertion, on behalf of Stevens. He is a poet of profound subjectivity and as far from the confessional as could be imagined. But a curious paradox operates in that. One takes what is supposed to be confessional poetry. First of all, it isn't poetry, and secondly, by the time I get to the end of any of those poems, I find that both I, as a reader, and whatever author or spirit one feels is moving in or behind the lines, are more opaque than either of us were at the beginning of the poem. Stevens, who did not want to tell one or tell himself anything about himself or oneself, to use his characteristic way of handling the self, was a poet of so deep a subjectivity, I think a subjectivity that rivals Whitman's or Wordsworth's. If you really work through this poem, you wind up with a kind of appalling knowledge, both self-knowledge and knowledge of the man and of the mode. But here, in any case, is the poem. And we'll set the title aside for a moment, but the title is very much part of the poem. Clear water in a brilliant fall, pink and white carnations. The light in the room more like a snowy air, reflecting snow. A newly fallen snow at the end of winter when afternoons return. Pink and white carnations. One desires so much more than that. The day itself is simplified, a ball of white, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. Say even that this complete simplicity stripped one of all one's torments, concealed the evilly compounded vital eye, and made it fresh in a world of white, A world of clear water, brilliant edged. Still one would want more, one would need more than a world of white and snowy scents. There would still remain the never-resting mind, so that one would want to escape, come back to what had been so long composed. The imperfect is our paradise. Note that in this bitterness, the light, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. I want to, as I say, go very slowly and ask questions that at first may seem picayune, may even dry or abstract. I mean, if you were asked what the poem is about, and at that point I always fall back upon one of my curious etymologies. I do believe that poems have a referential aspect in this. I differ from most of what passes for currently advanced literary criticism, but I think that what they are about is not truly what they are about. That is to say, about itself as a word, curiously enough, means to be on the outside of something. That is the etymological meaning of about. If you are about something, then you are on the outside of something. If you are about your own business, then in some sense you are on the outside of what it is that you are doing. This poem is about, it appears to be, the art of Japanese flower arranging. And I know a lot about Stevens as a person who's a very curious and methodical man who marched off to work on foot each day of his life there in Hartford. As I say, he's 58 when he writes this poem, but he's been set in his ways for a long time. He comes home to his house where he lives alone with his wife, their one child being away at school. And he always liked to. He always had fresh flowers sent, specifying what they were to be. And before he sat down with his pre-dinner drink, since he had read many books and kept them on the art of Japanese flower arrangement, he would make a flower arrangement. And that, in a deep sense, is what this poem is about. Yet there's something very curious about that from the beginning, and you can see that it shows up in the rhetoric of the poem from the very start. And I start with that opening word. What is redundant? What is excessive? What is, in a technical sense, unnecessary about saying clear water in a brilliant poem? As I say, the question will seem dry or picayune until one broods on it and sees, I think, the rhetorical principle involved in this. It is technically redundant. Why? If I told you that I wanted to put flowers in a nice shining bowl, and brilliant means, of course, we've now reached the point of this country where if you turn on the television set, it is used with a halfback who has just made a particularly brilliant run. But one should not forget the root meaning, and Stevens always wishes to restore what Walter Pater called the final, it's just a Freudian slip on my part, the finer, I wanted to say, F-I-N-E-R, edges of words. And the apocalyptic word final came out. I just watched myself. It's a sign of tiredness. Brilliant means, of course, to emit light, not just to reflect light. A brilliant surface is one which sends forth its own light, which is why tropologically it became used for human intelligence or human talent of any kind. It means that you don't just reflect a lamp or a light which is outside you, but you are, as it were, lamp as well as mirror, to use those two tropes for the aesthetic process, which are so ancient. If somebody sent you for water in which to put a flower arrangement, it would be rather odd. You wouldn't say, do you want clear or dirty water? Do you want clear or murky water? I mean, it would be a ridiculous kind of a question. Clear water is a redundancy. You do not need the word. And yet why do you have the word here? Why would you be rather bereft and unable to start the poem without it? And I hasten to point out that this kind of principle of redundancy or rhetorical overload is something you must confront in the very next sentence of the poem. And notice, by the way, how these sentences go. They all proceed by a curious principle of enjambment. He does not allow himself, in the first stanza of the poem, and indeed does not allow himself until he is down in the third stanza of the poem to give you a sentence which concludes at the end of a line by using enjambment or ending the line where he does in terms of the sentence structure. He is producing a peculiar effect from the beginning. But for instance, in the second sentence of the poem, or third line, more like what? If you are reading strictly, as you should, the light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow. That's been left out. And since I think nothing has been left out, since there is nothing you can compare it to, it is not more like than something else is, why do you have the word more at all? Why do you have the word clear in the first line when, strictly speaking, you don't need it, but obviously in the metrical and rhythmical pattern you would need some word there. It would sound rather lame to begin water in a brilliant bowl. No, that won't do. Clear water in a brilliant bowl. But still, the clear is technically redundant. It doesn't seem to work. The light in the room, like a snowy air reflecting snow, would appear to be all that you need. Why do you say more like? Except, of course, that more, once it's in there, never stops being in there. Pink and white carnations, one desires so much more than that. Cold, a cold porcelain, low and round, with nothing more than the carnations there. So more is picked up as a motif, and he will not let it alone. What does one mean by talking about rhetorical overload, or an overdetermination of language of any kind? A funny principle, and a rather difficult one to learn, but a great part of the history of the poetry of the last couple of hundred years is involved in it, and not just in English and American poetry, but certainly in French and German and Spanish poetry written in Spanish as well. As language, and there's a Freudian lesson in this also, of course, because it is true of the Freudian text, it may be true of the whole history of text, as language gets more and more rhetorically overdetermined, meaning gets underdetermined. As you tend to have a richer language, you tend to have a kind of dearth of meaning until finally, to use a paradox that I've explored endlessly in other places, you're almost commending a poet or indeed any writer for achieving a dearth of meaning, a really achieved dearth of meaning, as it were, which is what Stevens, or I think Ashbery and my own generation are especially adept at. It becomes a considerable achievement at a time when we are bombarded by excessive meanings, when the principle of rhetorical overload is throwing too much false meaning at it all the time, to write a text in which a dearth of meaning is very carefully achieved. Now, Stevens is handling it by a kind of language that does not quite work, and the question is why. For instance, in the light in the room, more like a snowy air, reflecting snow. Why does the notion of more like something, which is thus elliptically repressed or suppressed, isn't going to work? Why? It's not in fact a comparative that is being used there. The similitude of like a snowy air is what matters. It isn't more than something else. But if I dwell on this to the point of irritating you, and I know it is irritating to proceed in this way, it's because a great part of what is unique in this poem, or even this mode of poetry on Stevens, is invested in. But what is that first stanza trying to do?
I was going to say, I have the sense, though, that he is saying the light in the room more like a snowy air, implicit then like light, in the sense that something becomes more like something else in itself.
Well, you are trying to change the effect of light in the room. There's no question about that. The art of flower arrangement, particularly as practiced, in Japanese tradition, is to create an antithetical effect. That is to say, is to create an effect which is contra naturam. Thus, this poem was not written in winter, and the light effect that you're trying to get is absolutely independent of the seasonal cycle. It is a sense of winter in the mind. One must have a mind of winter, the famous poem which I asked you to read, the way the snowman begins. Now, one is trying to have a mind of winter with this flower arrangement, but it's a very particular mind of winter, isn't it? It's not dead of winter. It's not the total dedication of the snowman to nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is an attempt at achieving a light which will give you a certain kind of cognitive stance. And he sets what that stance is. A newly fallen snow at the end of winter when afternoons return. Now what kind, cognitively speaking, what is that to ask for? We have left out many steps in this, but I want to press on to something. You're making a flower arrangement. You begin by saying clear water in a brilliant fall. And then you have chosen flowers which, in terms of their colorations, since you might have ordered many other colors to the carnations, really are not unsuggestive, are they? Carnation, of course, means what? Why are they called carnations? First called that by the Italians, by the way. They're called carnations for what reason? You might guess.
They are red.
No, these are pink and white, my dear. Well, what word is contained in carnation? Incarnation, carnal, what does it suggest? Well,
Death.
simply that which refers to the body. Carnation or carnal or incarnation has to do with the body. And it was evidently noticed, and it is true if you will stare at a carnation, particularly pink and white carnations in conjunction, that they must have suggested to those splendidly sensual Italian gentlemen who presumably first named the flower carnation, they must have suggested female flesh. And if you speak of pink and white carnations with the overtone of incarnation, which after all doesn't necessarily mean anything religious, but just placing something in flesh or in a body, and if you speak of it in terms of, however sexist this may sound, it's still a traditional male trope to speak of the female body as being pink and white. It isn't, of course, pink and white, but then white people are not white and black people are not black. As E.M. Forster remarked long ago in a passage to India, what we call white should be called pinko grays, which is a splendid phrase. So women are not pink and white, but in an idealized sense they are. If, however, you have asked for carnations and you use the phrase pink and white carnations, then there is an unmistakable allusive overtone, which is intentional and is deliberate and is a crucial part of the undersong of the opening, of what you can call sublimation if you want to, but there is in it a faint touch which is going to be repeated again and again throughout the poem in terms of the lingering image of desire. There is some faint touch of what you could only call something which is emblematic, at least in a male idealization or illusion or self-deception, of a woman's body or the flesh of a woman. Now you are putting these flowers in a bowl which doesn't just reflect but emits light, and you put them in water of which you rather redundantly say that it is to be clear rather than in any sense stained or otherwise. Then you suddenly speak of the light, which is after all the entire art of a flower arrangement, particularly, I repeat, in the Japanese tradition, which is the modern sense of a flower arranging art. The entire notion is to create a particular effect of light, contra naturam, so that no matter what the weather outside the room is, as all the classical works on Japanese flower arrangement say, you will triumph over the outward weather with the weather of the mind. You will choose to signify or depict what you wish to represent, and that light will come to dominate the light in the room. But the more is very Stevensian. Not the light in the room like a snowy air, reflecting snow. And even that is curious. Notice that it isn't the snow on the ground that you are trying to get as the light of the mind, the light of the cognitive stance. The light surely, since in this poem from the start, as the title will tell you, the art of making a flower arrangement is at one with the art of writing a lyric poem, which is the characteristic, of course, Stevensian way of spending one's time when one isn't working, is one's enterprise. But clearly one is seeking to find a trope or figuration for one's characteristic stance as a poet. The light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow. Stevens really does write the American language far more subtly, I think, than Williams, who rather grossly is celebrated for doing it. When you say more like, as a phrase in itself, and you don't necessarily mean. Look, here's an American dialogue. We can cite it from Mark Twain. What was she like anyway? She was more like. Doesn't make sense, and yet we know what it means. Whereas it's very hard to convey to a Britisher what that means. How would you translate that? It's an actual moment in putting head. What was she like anyway? Well, she was more like. More like what? Well, we don't mean more like something than something else. We mean what? We don't mean I liked her more. There's a kind of shrug involved in it, of course, in colloquial speech. We still use it in that funny way. What kind of an afternoon did you have? You know, was it like what you expected it to be? More like. Really means more like than not. You know, it's almost more likely than not. The colloquial usage of like there has likely in it as much as the comparative of a similitude of any kind. If you say then of the light, which after all is an artificial light, the light of artifice or art, contra naturam, that you're trying to create by your poem or your flower arrangement, that it is more like a snowy air reflecting snow, what perhaps are you getting at? The snowy air is not snowy because fresh snow is coming down. It's not an air that you call snowy because the snow is falling through it, but because there is newly fallen snow on the ground, which is then, as it were, in the prism of air, being reflected into the transparency that otherwise you would be observing, give you a funny kind of a brilliance, a funny kind of a glow. And then he sets exactly where in the seasonal cycle he wants his flower arrangement to give you that slightly uncanny effect. A newly fallen snow, a freshness, something that you can see perhaps for the first time before somebody else has seen it because it had just fallen. One way of solving the problem of how you first have a first idea of anything is to be on the spot as the snow has just stopped falling, and you can say, look, I can see this particular scene of newly fallen snow before anybody has trampled on it or anybody is standing over my shoulder to see it. At the end of winter, not at the beginning of spring, but not in midwinter either, when that beautiful, and again quite American phrase, when afternoons return. What does it mean to say when afternoons return? Well, it catches a moment in your year as in mine, doesn't it? It catches a moment in consciousness, which is never quite a single moment. How would one characterize that one? Yeah? Sure. Sure. Yeah. What about it catches a moment in the apprehension of that? You might say the indirect apprehension of that. Not after all, he says, at the end of winter when days are longer, but at the days of winter when afternoons return. When you come to realize, deductively as it were, that the days are longer because you suddenly notice that there is an afternoon again, and that the afternoon, after all, has returned. So it's a kind of secondary knowledge rather than a primary one. And the first 5 lines come to a stop. Now, I call it rhetorical overload, or a kind of principle of rhetorical redundancy, because to convey the minimalism of that flower arrangement, he has really said a little too much. We have more words than we need in a poet of almost striated nuances. But what is the principle that is involved in that overload? Why does one say clear? Why does one say more like, therefore meaning in a sense I would think colloquially more likely, when it would have been enough to say like? Why do you want the word clear? Why do you want the word more? Why do you want the repetitions of the snow? Reflecting snow newly fallen at the end of winter when afternoons return would again have been enough. And yet you repeat the word snow when you don't strictly need it. You could take at least 3 words out of that, the second snow, the word more, and the word clear, and have almost the aesthetic effect that you have here. But of course you need the words for what? What are they doing and what are they going to do? Obviously clarification, almost ruthless clarification, simplification through intensity, to use a high romantic formula, is what you are trying to practice. But when you actually use the word simplified here, you use it with great bitterness. The day itself is simplified, and you wonder about that where it's simplified, and then it returns, I think, even more bitterly. And the question of how you can know that this is bitterness is something to talk about. And we'll say even that this complete simplicity, strip one, and so forth. But the clarity clearly has something to do with that simplicity, or that verb simplified. The more is picked up, as I say, as a motif, and becomes extremely ironic, and we'll go on to that in a moment, with one desires so much more than that, where I will give the game away from the start, but again perhaps irritate you by saying the only way I can read that is that the word more there is purely ironic, and as in the simplest but most brutal kind of irony, means exactly the opposite of what it appears to say. It is saying one desires so much less than that. So there's a bitterness in saying that also. And again, this may seem arbitrary to you, particularly at first, but that I think is why the more is there. And the snow is there twice for the same reason that, the clear is there because it's going to return again very bitterly in a world of clear water, brilliant edge, where the edge takes the place of the ball. And I want to talk about that. Let's talk about that now, even though this is the jump ahead. But you are subtle readers, one can jump ahead. What's the defeat in terms of the aesthetic artifice of the first stanza of saying that that world of clear water that you have created in this recreation of the day, in your poem or your flower arrangement, that the brilliancy shows up in particular at the edge? What kind of defeat is being recorded in that? Very considerable defeat, I think.
There's a sense of the contrast between what he's created and what actually is there.
Yes,
that
very.
edge. It's like the whole poem in a way, kind of gilded edge in a way.
Very shrewd on your part, but stay with us for a moment. You presumably were trying to get brilliance, more than presumably, you had to be getting brilliance in the flower arrangement. Therefore, what you can call art, as against a drab context of nature. The effect of what you've done is that you have neither created a more brilliant, as it were, abstraction than your natural context, nor have you done the reverse, where have you somehow enhanced nature or reality and made it more brilliant. The edge between the two is where the light shows up. Not so much gilt edge, but hard edge, in a very curious kind of way. You've made a kind of hard edge phantasmagoria, and you never meant to do it. You have a triumph neither of nature nor of art, but of the estrangement between the two. You have made the border, or the demarcation, to use Stevens' own trope for it at the end of Idea of Order of Key West, less ghostly rather than more ghostly. You have made the edge of the sound less keen, and therefore more blunt. Instead of ghostly demarcations, keener sounds, which is what you're asking for, your poetry, you have a hard or brilliant edge. You've defeated yourself, and that's made perfectly clear. And indeed, there is, I think, a deliberate echo, very bitterly self-intended, of the end of the Idea of Order of Key West, where instead of ghostly demarcations, keener sounds, you get flawed words and stubborn sounds, where the stubborn clearly does reply to the notion of keener or more acute, and therefore more moldable by the poet. And of course, the crucial word in the poem, the most peculiar, is that word lies. Why? Note that in this bitterness, the life, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. How do you read the word lies? There are two ways. There are several, but there are two which are overwhelming. Or tells us lies, tells us untruths. The question is does lies there, is that an active verb, meaning telling us an untruth? Or is it consists in, or coheres in, or is constituted by? I don't think you can have, and this is something to talk about a little bit later, I don't think you can have both meanings. You must choose. And one will disqualify or cast the other out. But let's go back to this principle of redundancy. Something of the snow will come out later. Look at the word more. We'll look briefly anyway at the first 5 lines. And presumably they are the design or intentionality of this lyric. The question of why you would be choosing that particular moment in the seasonal cycle as a figuration or trope for the stance you want to set up in your poem now becomes highly operative, doesn't it? You're going to choose not a snowman's vision, which is nihilism, which is the triple nothing at the end of a snowman, but an upward moment in the seasonal cycle. A newly fallen snow at the end of winter when afternoons return. You're not exactly going to be wholly in what Emerson called the optative mood, but at least there will be a movement towards more life, towards more light, literally towards more life. There will be some gesture of an opening rather than a total negation or purely a gesture of a closing, but it is minimal. It is very minimal, and it is, as it were, expressed with the left hand. And yet no sooner has one done it than how does one read this? You repeat pink and white carnations, and now I would speak more than ever of a principle of rhetorical overload. Why of redundancy? Why say pink and white carnations again? And what sense does it make? Why does one reject the notion that this can be read literally, as it were? Pink and white carnations, and then a dash, the only dash in the poem. One desires, and notice that the enjambment, the break comes on desires, which forces you to emphasize the word. One desires so much more than that. What's wrong with reading that literally, clearly? Look, if somebody walked into my office at Yale one day, some young man or young woman, and said, pink and white carnations, one desires so much more than that, one would obviously scratch one's head. I mean, if one is so far gone with all the fleshly overtones of pink and white carnations that one called upon to say one desires so much more than that, when it in itself is the merest faint trace or simulacrum of, the body of a sexual other, then it is an outrageous and improbable statement, literally speaking. But let me give you an aesthetic context for this, aside from the context of this poem. Think of the plays of Oscar Wilde, to which Stevens was devoted. I'm not saying he's specifically thinking of this, but when you have the context of an art of flower arrangement, you are in the world of Whistler, of Pater, of Wilde, of the so-called English decadence, of the young Yeats, of Ronald Fairbanks, to whose writing the early Stevens was devoted. You're in the world of exquisites and dandies. You're in the world, say, of Algernon and Ernest, in the importance of being earnest. I could easily imagine, in a play by Oscar Wilde, and A Woman of No Importance, or The Importance of Being Earnest, or Lady Windermere's Fan, one of these exquisite young men like Algernon walking into somebody's drawing room or one's own, staring at a bowl of pink and white carnations and saying, and the audience would understand it and would laugh because it would be a rather wicked joke, pink and white carnations, and then a pause. One desires so much more than that. That makes an elaborate joke out of it. That makes it a very complex kind of a sexual joke, because what it really means is how vulgar a representation of the possibility of the flesh of a sexual other, something as overt as pink and white carnations are. Not really very overt at all. I mean, it took me a while to recollect for you just what it is about that, which does amount to a representation of the possibility of a sexual fulfillment. So that if one says of it, one desires so much more than that, what one really means is how vulgar pink and white carnations are in their sexual suggestiveness. One must have emblems, of course, if art is to continue, of a sexual suggestiveness, but they should be even more minimal and spare and abstract than something as declarative as pink and white carnations. Now, that funny kind of bitterness of the high aesthetic movement, that Wildean trope, if I'm reading that right, I mean, of course, rhetorical irony of the simplest kind. The simplest illustration is the one given by Quintilian thousands of years ago. Think of a day of really filthy weather, with a ghastly rain so falling that you can scarcely see daylight outside, even though it's high noon. If on such a day you stare up at a window from inside an office and you say in an utterly dry tone of voice, what a beautiful day it is, then you are using that simplest form of irony, which the ancient Romans called illugio. You are saying just the opposite of what you mean. If somebody arrives half an hour late for an appointment with you, and you say to them in a very quiet tone of voice, how very kind of you, to come, it obviously is the simplest kind of irony. It means what an abomination you are to have treated me so that you walk in half an hour late. Or you mean the weather is absolutely filthy today. Or you mean one desires so much less than that. In which case, what critique has Stevens made already of the opening 5 lines of this poem? If that is a right reading, and it's the reading I have taught myself after some time, if that is a right reading, if this thing is really as subtle as that, then you have 2 questions raised. One is, how should it be read? The second is, what are you doing to yourself when you write a poem which depends upon ironies as simple and yet at the same time as agonized as that, and yet they will come more and more strongly. Pink and white carnation, one desires so much more than that. The day itself is simplified. What's the enormous bitterness of putting the enjambment at the word itself? But you don't need the word itself, which is again why I return you to this principle of redundancy or rhetorical overload, though by now you weren't wearied of the phrase as I use it. Why don't you simply write the day is simplified? Obviously, the intensification of saying the day itself and putting itself at just the point where the enjambment of the line comes forces you to see a little more clearly what in some sense is being suggested. What is being suggested at that point? Your desire is for simplification. Your desire is to clear things. Your desire is to get down to a first idea of what a poem can be, as though indeed no one had seen earlier than yourself what it is that you are trying to do. You're trying to achieve simplification through intensity through this particular flower arrangement. That's the way you lead your life. That is the way you act when you get home from the office. That is what you do when you write a poem called The Poems of Our Climate. What are you actually doing to yourself? What kind of an art are you actually practicing? Pink and white carnation. One desires so much more than that. The day itself is simplified. What are you doing at that point dramatically, probably? The day, after all, is nothing that you've created. It is not part of your flower arrangement. And yet, uncannily, something has just happened. If at that point, for instance, you were to visualize the poet staring out through a window, what is he looking at? The day itself is simplified, a ball of white. That ball of white is no longer the brilliant ball, the porcelain, in which he has made the flower arrangement. In fact, stop a moment. Does porcelain emit light?
Your first impression is the book.
Well, whatever the ball is, and I don't think it emits himself, a brilliant ball has got to be one that emits light. But the cold porcelain does not refer to the ball in which the flower arrangement is. What does it refer to? Yeah, a ball of white. He's actually using them. This hadn't occurred to me until I don't know how many hundreds of times I've read through this poem as a paradigm of how to read a poem, when I suddenly saw what it was. It goes all the way back to that very pre-Raphaelite poem, Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And that inverted ball we call the sky. And that's the trope. The ball of white is, as Omar Khayyam says in the Fitzgerald version, that ball, that inverted ball, we call the sky. That he now calls a cold porcelain, comparing the Keats's Grecian urn, not the actual bowl in which he is making the flower arrangement, but the all too successful attempt, the as it were magical or uncanny or aesthetic effect of his flower arrangement on his own perception as he steers outside and sees the day and sees that indeed in becoming a reductionist to and of the first idea, this is what he has made the day, any day in fact, into. The day itself is simplified. To go on making flower arrangements of this kind, to go on writing poems of this kind, to take up this aesthetic, moral, spiritual, cognitive stance, is to convert the sky itself, the outer weather itself, into the inverted bowl we call the sky, is to make it into a cold, strange object like Keats's cold porcelain, low and round, and then an extraordinary line, and the most redundant line in the first stanza. Technically, and I promise not to use the word again, the rhetorical overload or principle of redundancy is never greater than here. We have nothing more than the carnations there, a line of extreme, almost excessive bitterness. Why does one say that? Why does one invoke bitterness? Even though he himself will not use the phrase, in this bitterness, until the third stanza. And when he does use it, he sure enough is using it in its finer edge, in its etymological meaning. What does the word bitterness mean, by the way? Fascinating etymology. We call something bitter because it is what? Because it is broken. The word originally meant, bitterness means brokenness. But of course, what does the word imperfect mean? When something is perfectus, it is what? Well, the carpenter's word originally, it is absolutely finished. Perfectus means it is finished. Imperfect means unfinished. Bitterness means brokenness. He is certainly playing on that. What is the brokenness of the excessively finished quality of what one has, alas, accomplished more even than one could have intended to accomplish there in the opening stanza? What have you done to this guy? Why are you comparing it to the Keatsian porcelain vase of the Grecian urn? Which is presumably, look, you couldn't be as far away from Keats as you wanted to be, no matter how hard you're trying, is one thing he's telling himself rather bitterly, I think, in this poem, though in a rather subtle way. You didn't set out with a Grecian urn. You didn't set out with a chunk of porcelain. You must have set out with some shining metal, I think, or glass perhaps, but more likely shining metal, because glass would only reflect light. So I think you set out with something which is emitting light, with some kind of either semi-precious material or silver, which does have a shine or a brilliance of its own. Here, water in a brilliant ball, he does not use words lightly. He's trying to force you as a reader to read a poem, which is a very difficult kind of thing to deal with. It's geared up to get you in a certain kind of a way. Let's talk about the Grecian urn for a moment. At the close of that poem, are you as a reader, or Keats as presumably the mediating voice speaking the poem, are you closer or further away from both the world depicted, or worlds depicted, the scenes depicted on the urn, which are entirely erotic, but not images of fulfillment, but of perpetual chase, of course. But in terms of what is depicted there, or even in terms of the entire sphere, as it were, of the represented, of art, as it were, are you closer or further away from the ball and what is represented, the urn, what is represented on it, at the close of the poem or at the opening? Even though he says, in the strangest moment in the poem, to whom thou wilt remain, a friend, true man, to whom thou sayest, and then that strange, so equivocal identification of truth and beauty. The feeling of estrangement, the feeling of distance, the feeling of a remoteness, the feeling that the dilemma of the poet is to be trapped in his own, indeed, highly tubercular world, which is a definite element in the poem, that the world is indeed finished and made perfect, but is increasingly cold and remote, increases all through the poem, and the whole burden of that is the burden of crying out cold pastoral, which is technically a kind of oxymoronic sort of construction. Stevens repeats the cold, and again, I promised I wouldn't talk about rhetorical redundancy or overload, but notice he says cold twice when he doesn't need it. And so there it is again. The entire stanza is, I think, rhetorically constructed upon that. And why finally does one make such a to-do about that? You are writing supposedly a minimalist art. Your poetic father, beyond a doubt, is Walt Whitman, who, though hermetic and difficult, as we began to see last week, is partly a poet of minimal effects, or of minimal gestures. His gestures are exuberant. His effects are the high sublime. They are overwhelming. He writes these extraordinary chants, or these sudden openings up, or these enormous synecdochal identifications, from which he may start back in sudden revulsion a few times, but which nevertheless overwhelmingly succeed on their own terms. You are writing a very different mode of art. You are trying to make very minimal gestures. The trope that you're using, the art of Japanese flower arrangement, involves taking a little bit of water and a bowl which emits light, and a few pink and white carnations, and out of it, by combining them at just the right angle, in just the right kind of a way, with just the right twist in them, by an extraordinary abstraction, totally negating context, including the weather of the outward day. And yet, in order to achieve this art, in this stanza, you have had to write a rhetoric of deliberate overload, of repetitions, and one wonders why the repetitions are there, of saying what is intellectually the simple mode of irony, but which in its presence here is increasingly palpably bitter. The day itself is simplified. A bowl of white, a cold porcelain. By the way, the porcelain is a private language with Stevens. In a poem written just before this, extracts from addresses to the Academy of Fine Ideas. In one moment in it, a slightly mad lecturer to the non-existent Academy cries out, let the secretary for porcelain observe that laughter made evil produces a certain glaze, and so on. Perfectly clear that the secretary for porcelain in this mad academy is John Keats. By the time you reach the poem I've asked you to read for next time, so secondarily as it were, to concentrate on the auroras of autumn, an ordinary evening in New Haven, at one point Stevens, contemplating the possibility of writing a poem, writes the extraordinary line, a porcelain, comma, as yet in the vats thereof. People do not use dictionaries. In commentaries on Stevens before my own, I have seen some weird things in which people wonder if this isn't so realistic and if that's, but of course, what do bats mean in relation to porcelain? If only you would go to a dictionary, or only if you know it otherwise. What is bats in that sense?
Well, my husband is doing ceramics now.
Exactly.
And,
The unbaked clay, the chunks of unbaked clay, which eventually in your work will become a porcelain. So the line, a porcelain, comma, as yet in the vats thereof, which is a rather difficult and peculiar line, and rather bitter means, I would like this to be Keats's Grecian urn, but about all I seem to be producing are so many slabs of unbaked clay. So no question, therefore, what porcelain means for this poet. It always does mean the Grecian urn. You're not comparing your flower arrangement, I repeat, to the Grecian urn. You are comparing to one particular moment in the Grecian urn, a very subtle and I think highly deliberate, but very bitter allusion, a wounding synecdoche, I would call it, against the self. You are saying, in fact, in Freudian sense, I think you are turning aggressivity against the self at this point in the poem, as I would read off this poem's defenses and or tropes. It seems to me they are identical. You surely are saying something like this. I have tried for a particular kind of an effect. I have been all too successful. What I have done is to make the outward day into the equivalent of Keats's urn at just that moment when Keats realizes in the poem that all he has succeeded in doing by writing the poem is estranging himself yet further from the world that he desires to join in the aesthetic register. The day itself is simplified, a bowl of white, a cold porcelain, low and round. That is what the inverted dome of the sky is, with nothing more than the carnations there. And what would the force or signification of that last line be? With nothing more than the carnations there. And obviously you're now playing completely, you've rung the changes on the word more. The light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow. Pink and white carnations, one desires so much more than that. A bowl of white, the cold porcelain low and round with nothing more than the carnations there. By the time you hear the peal or the bell ring of that third more, what are you hearing? What does that line seem to signify? With nothing more than the carnations there. That means triumph, doesn't it? In the direct signification? It's not the force of the line, but it is the signification of it. Look, if the whole day, the whole inverted bowl of the sky, dome of the sky, which is the sky, which is the context, if you have so succeeded that there's nothing more now in the whole day except the carnations there, that means you've done it. You have performed, as it were, the Zen of flower arrangement to the highest degree. You have utterly transformed reality. You are a complete aesthetic success as a flower arranger or the writer of a lyric. What kind of a success have you got? With nothing more than the carnations there. Pink and white carnations, one desires so much more than that. Look at the flatness of that and the irony of that. And finally, the light in the room more like a snowy air reflecting snow. But what was one trying to do with that kind of more, in making that more likely? That is to say, what is the point of this enterprise? Even on its own terms, it can succeed entirely too well, and the effect is to impoverish reality. Without enhancing itself, it has merely impoverished reality. And that has enormous parabolic force, though I grant you that it has chosen rather subtle means to reach that point, and I would never be prepared to answer to what extent this can have been wholly conscious on Stevens' part. And indeed, though I think it is transparent, and I use the word deliberately in the Emersonian and Whitmanian as well as Stevensian sense, because we're going to come up to it, though not as a word, but I think it is a transparent reading once you begin to see it. It takes you a hell of a long time to get to that reading. Otherwise, you seem to have an almost opaque surface here, and yet, in the light of that, to use, a language I am more familiar with, you can almost write the second and the third stanzas over the first as a kind of midrash on a text. It's something we're just trying to get at what lies between the lines of the text. Let's look at the second stanza. Say even that, and there's American speech again, as I first learned in trying to teach this poem to a British group at Oxford a few years ago. What does that say even? That's American speech, what? When do we say that to another? Say even that this is so. What do we mean? Say even that this is so. Doesn't matter. That is to say, even though I think your argument is completely wrong, even though I don't think your premise holds at all, look, I'll give it to you. Say even that what you say is so, it would still be something or other. It's a very characteristic American rhetorical gesture. What is it doing here? Well, it is, as it were, Stevens answering a kind of idiot questioner, to use a Blakean phrase in himself. Say even that. Obviously, this complete simplicity of achieved art has not stripped one of all one's torments. But even if it had, he says, and that's what the first 5 lines are about, but we'll go back to that in a moment, say even that all this had happened, and it hasn't. He denies the premise, that's what the first stanza is surely telling you. Still one would want more. And there's that more again. One would need more, and he gives you 3 mores. What? And I guess I'm going to stick to those 2 lines for a moment. Still one would want more. One would need more. And the more is getting to be a litany, almost a kind of insane litany. It's a maddening effect. More than a world of white and snowy sense. Why that triple more? What does more mean anyway? I don't think etymology helps much with this, just usage helps. What does one mean by more? The most famous thing ever said about more in English, and Stevens is well aware of it, so I don't say that this is allusion, is of course Blake's proverb of hell, which goes, more is the cry of a mistaken soul, less than all cannot satisfy man. Now that is, of course, as we say, a high romantic kind of a vision of what the limitation of more is. But of course, more is less would be a problem for this poem anyway, because if so much more than that means one desires so much less than that, if that Wildean paradox is what is involved here, then you have a kind of a problem here also, because you have pure litotes or understatements. If it does not make literal sense to say pink and white carnations one desires so much more than that, it's a howler. It's an extraordinary understatement. It's the opposite of the sublime to say, for anyone, still one would want more, one would need more than a world of white and snowy sense. That is such an understatement that it would be purely outrageous if it were to be read literally. It has got to be read as litotes, or peculiar understatement. But what kind of an understatement? Only a ghost, presumably, would not want more or need more than a world of white and snowy sense. But at this point, one is clearly involved in a homonym, or near pun. What? Yeah. Very difficult, to pronounce the word sense in an American accent of any kind, and avoid the word sense, S-E-N-S-E, which is such a funny word. I mean, whatever it means for the French, for us the 2 major elements in its meaning seem to go against one another, because sense in the sense of the senses, and sense in terms of making sense, are, though related, quite different ultimately in the directions that they take as we handle meaning in English. So to involve yourself in that pun is to create a curious problem, since sense in the sense of the senses would go very well with S-C-E-N-T-S, which is one version of a sense, but a world of white and snowy sense in terms of something you are trying to achieve as meaning, whether by way of, as I said before, to use that French distinction these days, of force as against signification, raises a curious kind of a problem. But go back to the 5 lines, which are marvelous and very American. What, for instance, is happening which is odd in the second line there? How is he using stripped and concealed? And this has, again, something to do with his rhetorical mode of procedure, which is purely Whitmanian. I remember when some years ago, in things I wrote or spoke, I started to compare him with Whitman. The incredulity that I met with it has been one of the tenets of the American New Criticism of the earlier time, that a poet like Stevens and a poet like Whitman had absolutely nothing in common. What they have most in common, of course, is that they both write in appositional style, not oppositional, but appositional. He had learned from the Whitmanian technique, which we normally call cataloging, to set up a series of appositions. And this poem is based, I would say, if I wanted to make a technical statement about it, it takes that principle, and I swear I won't use it again, of rhetorical overdetermination or redundancy, and makes it into a mode of apposition, makes it into an appositional style. And here's an instance of it. Say even that this complete simplicity, stripped one of all one's torments, concealed the evilly compounded vital I. Stripped and concealed as active verbs there are being used in apposition, as though they meant precisely the same thing, as though they did exactly the same work. Unfortunately, in their dictionary meaning, they mean something exactly opposite to one another. When we strip something, we are presumably removing things. When we are concealing, we are presumably hiding things. But of course, what is he getting at by putting them in apposition? Stripped one of all one's torments. Is torment perhaps a trope or a substitution for that? Concealed, and then you have a line which is not so much perhaps redundant as it is apparently oxymoronic. That is to say, seemingly there's a self-contradiction in that line. An I or ego which is evilly compounded would not seem to have the same affect as an I which is vital. If you are proclaiming a vital I, normally you would indeed be a vitalist. You would be, say, D.H. Lawrence, or these days, the wordy Mr. Mailer. But if you speak of an I which is evilly compounded, you would be a Melville, or you would be a Hawthorne. You presumably would have a strong moral vision rather than primarily a vitalistic kind of a stance. You would be speaking in terms of a dualism, presumably, rather than the kind of monism that a vitalistic doctrine usually involves. Or to put it in the terms these days, the evilly compounded would certainly suggest our most characteristic form of dualism, which is the Freudian one. I don't know that we have a characteristic mode of vitalism or monism available to us at this time, except in a few writers. There really are no contemporary Laurentians or Blakeians or Rambolians in that kind of a sense. But surely the same principle, as it were. Again, I would say redundancy or overload in making stripped and concealed do the same work by acquisition, or by saying of this ego or I that it is both evilly compounded and vital. What perhaps is one getting at, or what kind of effect, whether or not one is getting at it, is being achieved? What kind of burden of meaning do you have to deal with? I mean, I suggest again that this is relevant for what we've been doing. It does seem a little hard to practice rhetorical analysis with this intensity when we haven't been doing it, because I think the poem is being driven to these desperations, to these rhetorical urgencies, by its overwhelming need to overcome a facticity, a Emersonian, Whitmanian, wholly American, and yet at the same time its realization that by trying to overcome this facticity, it is merely falling into exactly that mode of Emersonian or Whitmanian transparency or self-reliance that it wants to detach itself from. Look, even he says, if I grant you that this attempt at radical simplification for intensity works, say even that this complete simplicity, and he's now ascribing, notice, a psychological motivation to why he's been practicing either the art of writing this kind of a lyric, the lyric or the first idea, let us call it, or making a flower arrangement anyway, or obviously why he is the kind of psyche that he is, or the kind of personality that he is. One wishes, by practicing this kind of an art, this kind of a psychic economy, to strip oneself of all one's torments. The question is, what can torment be there? And a lot depends upon what the word evilly means in the next line. That will relate to torment. What does evil appear to mean in this poem? He calls one major poem esthétique du mal. But he clearly, though he is ironically echoing the fleur de mal in the title, he clearly does not mean evil in the sense of moral good and evil, as in some sense for all the aesthetic dignity of the fleur de mal, Baudelaire clearly does intend. What does evil mean in esthétique du mal? What does evil mean here?
It modifies mentality.
Okay. And it simply seems to mean it's a synonym for naturally. That is to say, evil, sure, evil in Stevens, in his constant usage, always means shake not thy handsome-headed me. It always does mean, in his actual usage of it, the necessary pain and suffering of being merely natural, and that being a necessary component of the human. It is not a moral term at all. Evilly compounded only means naturally compounded, and is indeed redundant, because the vital I, therefore, and the evilly compounded are not in opposition, but in apposition to one another. The question then is, of course, why use the word evil or evilly anyway? I think he always knows what he is doing when he subverts words. Throughout esthétique du mal, evil, or in extracts from addresses to the Academy of Fine Ideas, or 40 other places that I can think of in his poetry, he uses the word evil in a context and in a way which makes clear he does not mean in any sense conventional or unconventional ideas of good and evil, whether beyond them in the Nietzschean sense or before them in an older or moralistic sense. Evil means what you endure as torment. It means the necessary pain and suffering of, if you are human, of being merely natural. And one can see that it must mean that here because of the appositional structure. So what are you trying to do by simplicity? You cannot undo any good or evil sort of a matter. You can undo the natural. You can give yourself a kind of artifice that will reduce the natural to only another artifice. But what will the effect be? You are trying to make things fresh. You are trying to indeed achieve an earlier seeing or first idea by a mode presumably of complete simplicity. But what does simplicity mean? When you say the day itself is simplified, you mean you've made the inverted dome of the sky into an aesthetic artifact, like the Grecian urn, or actually like I think the text of Keats's poem. Oh, what have you done here? Say even that this complete simplicity. Now complete simplicity would mean, on the basis of the first stanza, and what simplified meant there, it means taking every day, any day, and making it a purely aesthetic kind of a matter. Or I'll take that further, making it into an aesthetic routine. An aesthetic routine is, I know, an almost oxymoronic kind of a phrase. Say even that this aesthetic routine, this complete simplicity, stripped one of all one's torments. What would one be like stripped of all one's torments? Well, that would be to conceal the naturally compounded, the natural pain and suffering of being human, that I remains vital, and yet there is pain and suffering in it. It would be concealed. What would you be concealing? You would be concealing pain and suffering, and thus you would have what he called elsewhere an ever early candor, a freshness which is also a whiteness. Hence now the image of the snow. White and snowy indeed, but what would you be doing? And made it fresh in a world of white, a world of clear water, returning you to the opening words of the poem, where clear water is followed by brilliant, brilliant is followed by bold, now brilliant is followed by a hyphen and by edge. And I come back to the point that you made so well for me before. What has one done? One has not even simplified the day. He now revises himself. One has not, in fact, made the day into an aesthetic artifice, because, look, you set out to do something else. You set out to make the light in the room the light of a particular cognitive and aesthetic status. You succeeded too well, you thought, for a while. You produced an effect in which, in a rather horrible way, you made the day more brilliant than your silver bulb. But it's a very odd meaning of brilliancy. Now you say, look, I haven't done either, and this would seem to be the truth. One has made, in one's world of white or world of clear water, a more brilliant edge. One has made the demarcation between art and nature not ghostlier, which would be a successful or persuasive or mimetic art. One has made it more obtrusive. One has made, therefore, exactly what one identifies as the stigma of the aesthetic movement or an aestheticism of any kind, the self-conscious mode of art, an art that, as the poem say, declares its own status as rhetoricity, and does it here, I repeat, through a kind of redundancy, through an appositional stance which is about to lead to real problems in the closing part of the poem. But then one would want more, very flatly, one would need more than a world of white and snowy sense, which as positive meaning is almost impossible to identify, since the negation of meaning there is so great. Then what about the last? Yes, go on.
Maybe we're going to get to this in the last part, but I think something that noticed going on too in terms of the sensual modalities of the poem, I've noticed in Stevens in general, it's clearly very much a visual. It's the visual sense dominates the light and this whole playing with the painterly style almost, and that he would end up with more than a world of white and snowy sense, or something in this that I think hooks into the carnation, the sense of smell and bitterness, taste and smell are somehow connected up with this natural evil. I mean, there's a certain, and I mean, it's in Freud talks about one of the primal repressions, the repression of smell, or this development of a kind of stance, standing up away from. And
repression certainly enters into this to a remarkable degree. I'm not quite sure about the distribution of the senses in Stevens, and I don't think that in the end he is a painterly poet in precisely that sense. He doesn't trust the ear, it's true. Unlike Wordsworth, who tries to de-emphasize what he calls the most despotic of our bodily senses, Stevens seems to fear that the ear is the most despotic and the most dangerous of the bodily senses. That may be why he dislikes birdsong so much. He's unique, I think, in the whole history and poetry in hating birdsong of any kind. There's no philosophical fiction most remarkably shows one. But the element of repression is crucial there. I thought it is this kind of whiteness which will lead to the great crisis in him. He is playing on, as he plays even in The Snowman, on just those Emersonian passages about opacity and transparency that we were looking at. He is playing already on the notion of the blank, though he does not use the word blank here. And in the poem called The Auroras of Autumn, which is a crucial text I'm asking you to read for next time, he hits the major crisis of his poetry, and I suspect also not so repressed the form of his life. He's walking on a beach, and he suddenly cries out in the most dramatic moment of self-portrayal, maybe the only one in his entire poetry. He looks around him on every side, and it's almost as though everything is suddenly reduced to the color of a boiled white of an egg, something horribly opaque, and he cries out there on the beach, here, being visible, is being white, is being of the solid of white, the accomplishment of an extremist in an exercise. That may be the most bitter line he ever writes. The accomplishment of an extremist in an exercise. It's perfectly clear that the accomplishment is to be trapped by this blank opacity on every side. It's perfectly clear that the extremist is himself. It's perfectly clear that the exercise is that characteristic exercise of his poetry, of reducing to a whiteness or a snowiness, of exercising the mind of winter, which the Poems of Our Climate tries to exemplify and clearly shows you it cannot bear to exemplify. But hold on in this for a moment, because I don't think it's a particular sense which stops him. Look at the opening of the third section. There would still remain the never-resting mind. When you speak of a mind as being never-resting, are you being merely descriptive in regard to it? Are you being eulogistic or praising it? Are you denigrating it? What is most likely? You have to write. I'll be banal about this, but one wants to be reductive so as to save time. If I have to write a recommendation, say for some particularly young lady, and I write in the recommendation she has a restless mind, or if I write in the recommendation she has a never-resting mind, it makes quite a difference, doesn't it? If I write she has a restless mind, I'm not necessarily doing her any good. If I write she has a never resting mind, I am praising her. Therefore, and one sees why that is so, to say restless is to imply anxiety, or to imply something merely natural. Perhaps again the evil, the pain or suffering, the torment of being human, all too human in her particular case. But if you say the never-resting mind, if you say of him or her that he or she has a never-resting mind, then you imply cognition, then you imply the intellectual activity as such, which is resisting poem here. There would still remain the never-resting mind, so that one would want to escape. Escape what? Come back, and those words are being used appositionally, and again you don't need both. So the question is, why do you have both? Come back to what had been so long composed. And you have the problem which you're going to have all through this stanza, and I think it comes out of the, what I've been calling redundancy, or the appositional in the poem. What had been so long composed? There are two absolutely different possibilities for interpretation there, and you can only take one. And yet the language would seem to admit it both. Which is why, in the end, I would stop at anybody who says that language is in itself a necessary mode of explanation, or that you can have a linguistic reading of any poem whatsoever, or even a language determined meaning. What is determining meaning here? What had been so long composed was two clearly possible referential possibilities, and they absolutely clash with one another. Yes?
Well, on the one hand, he says that language itself is so long composed. I mean, the actual material he's working with is already composed for him, and that his own trying to work it over, reworking of it in a sense, is of making a composition.
But be a little stricter. Let me break into you. In terms of what the poem has presented, in terms of speaking of that brilliant edge, what had been so long composed, there are two clear possibilities. They both involve language. The language is on both sides of the equation. Well, one is the world, or the day, or what you will. The other is your flower arrangement, no? One is the world as it was. The other is the world as you tried to make it. Which had been so long composed? I think he's relying on Nietzsche here. Nietzsche says that the primordial poem of mankind is what we take to be our sense of the visible, or indeed sensual universe, but that in fact it's a mere fiction. It's not a dopham, but a fiction. It is a poem or a story or a fiction that was made up a long time ago. And that may be the reference here. The day, or the world, or reality, or nature, call it what you will, may be that what which had been so long composed. But of course he's playing on composed, and there's a difficulty there, because composed certainly does mean serene, or not anxious. It also does mean put together as a composer puts together, or as a painter, or as a poet. You compose a poem. We usually don't say that. We say one composes a work of music, but you could just as soon say one composes rather than one writes a poem. These days where too much has been made out of the trope of writing, I wish one would say more often, one composes a poem, so as to get oneself away from some of the dead level of concealed literalism that the trope of writing has taken on in much critical argument. But of course, what had also been so long composed is the characteristic practice of this art. He had discovered this mode of writing certainly as early as the Snowman poem, which is 1923 or so. He is writing this poem when this is 1938. He's speaking of 15 years back. If that is the right referential reading, only one thing is clear to me. You must take one or the other, because you cannot have both, and that's going to be the problem of lies again. But at that point you get into another difficulty. For one time in this poem, you had a sentence which is also a line. That's a very clear line, and he just inserted it into the poem. And one uses here knowledge outside the poem. He kept a notebook of what he called adagia, apophthegms, or aphorisms. Many of them are just one sentence. It's in there, it's a prose sentence. It had been composed long this, and I think long ere this, and I think, by the way, there's a joke here. Come back to what had been so long composed as two clear referential possibilities, but here's a third one. I come back to this little adage or aphorism or apothegm that I stuck in my adagio. I come back to my realization that the imperfect is our paradise. Now we have a real problem of redundancy. That line, printed as an aphorism, as a prose sentence by itself, means almost the opposite of what that line means as a line of verse by being contextualized in exactly the middle of the last stanza of this poem if he has now done it, and he must know that because we know that immediately. I give you a list of adagia, of apothegms, and one of them is the imperfect is our paradise, then I almost sound like a parody of Robert Browning, don't I? And Browning, by the way, I consider a greater poet than Stevens, so I don't mean to malign him. But it sounds indeed like the optative stance gone mad, as it does occasionally in the verser by powerful Browning. It sounds like, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? The great adage of Ibn Ezra as worked out by Browning, but perfectly mad and horribly persuasive in its context, sort of a mode. That is to say, it sounds like this is rather a good thing, that the imperfect really is our paradise. The is takes on the force of a copula, but not when you put it as a line of verse in here. No, because imperfect is then picked up in bitterness and in the most amazing apposition in this poem, or perhaps in all of Stevens. Extraordinary art that gives you bitterness, a comma, and then delight, a comma, and does what to you by doing that? The language, of course, is curious. Whenever Stevens uses the word note, as in notes toward a supreme fiction, watch out. Because whenever he is going to use a kind of mock scholarly language, it's because he feels himself under real stress, real pressure in writing. Note that. It sounds dry, but it isn't dry. Note that in this bitterness. Now, this bitterness undoubtedly takes as antecedent, by all the laws we have, how you determine an antecedent, which is that the one nearest to hand, if it works, must be taken, in the imperfect. The imperfect is this bitterness. But the copula, if it is a copula, if it is, connects them. Note that in this bitterness, the light lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds. Why? Since the imperfect is so hot in us. But that's one way of reading it. And that would be the way the syntax works. But that isn't the way he's arranged the word order. Note that in this bitterness, delight, as though bitterness and delight were an absolute apposition. But of course, bitterness and delight, we would customarily want to think, we had better think. If you reach a point where bitterness is a delight for you, or delight is a bitterness for you, watch out, you're in a very bad way. And Stevens realizes that he's in a very bad way. As we all realize, as we all reach that point, that we get to be in a very bad way. Let's say he's taken oppositional words and by set them up in such apposition that they would appear to mean the same thing. But he's juggling all kinds of things here. And he's been building towards this effect all through the poem, a kind of powerfully fused art that I think I'm only beginning to understand, because, though it's naive perhaps to talk about whether or not something fused at this level can be conscious. On the one hand, I cannot believe that this is conscious artifice, any more than I can believe, that similar effects in a poet, say even more powerfully fused like Shakespeare or Milton, consists of a conscious art. On the other hand, you can hardly call this unconscious when it is cognitive through and through, when the workings are wholly cognitive. To call it unconscious, say, in a Freudian sense, the terms not of the descriptive but of the so-called dynamic unconscious, makes no sense at all, Freudian sense or not. So go back to this. What about the imperfect is our paradise? Why does one say that in terms of what happens in the next three lines, it cannot mean in the poem what it means outside the poem? And if it cannot mean in the poem what it means outside the poem, it means almost its opposite, then it means that our paradise is very imperfect indeed. Not that in imperfection, or that which is not finished, or the incomplete, we find our paradise, which is grand, because what would the heaven be for if I couldn't exceed our grasp and all that jazz, but something quite different. Our paradise is very imperfect indeed. What then is our paradise? Note that in this bitterness, our paradise, the imperfect, the incomplete, the broken, which is what bitterness is, the light lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds, but then you have a real problem. The light coheres or consists in or is contained in flawed words and stubborn sounds. But he uses the word lies. The light lies to us, presumably, in what? In flawed words and stubborn sounds, in poems that don't succeed, presumably, as they ought to succeed, as this poem is not one of ghostly or demarcation's keenest sounds, but one is suddenly aware is flawed words and stubborn sounds. The flawed is a Keatsian word, and he takes it from Keats, because what does it mean? In the Eve of St. Agnes, or again and again in Keats, the word flawed is used in the old meaning, a meaning though which he still has enough in New England to this day. Flawed means what? Blown by the wind. It's wind drift, which is why we speak of the substance as being flawed. If he is restoring that meaning, which he was aware of, even from a New England usage, that bitterness, delight lies in wind-blown words and stubborn sounds, then you almost have the Shelleyan trope being restored to you. But I've left out the most crucial line in the poem. How do you read, since the imperfect is so hot in us? That's a queer line, and a very American line. That's the American use of hot, isn't it, rather than the British? Why do I say that? That's hot stuff, as it were. Why do I say that? I say this only because I ran into this with Oxonians, the scum of the earth as they are. Yes?
Is it sexual?
Oh, sure, it's got to be sexual. I mean, the British usage is, think of a very powerful moment in George Meredith's Modern Love. Very beautiful and powerful from the major British uses of hot in that sense. Ah, what a dusty answer gets the soul when hot for certainties in this our life. Still the standard British usage of hot, though rarely as powerful as that. What does that mean as George Meredith is writing it there? Ah, what a dusty answer gets the soul when hot for certainties in this our life. Hot means what? Avid, excessively avid, desperately needing or wanting certainties. But hot stuff, the American or sexual meaning, never imported to the British Isles so far as I can tell, the jazzier kind of thing, which is, by the way Whitman uses the term in plenty of passages, because it's a 19th century piece of slang as well as a 20th. What does that mean here? Note that in this bitterness, delight, since the imperfect is so hot in us, he was hot for her, she was hot for him. Doesn't mean, when hot for certainties, doesn't mean too avid for something. The notion of too much, the notion of excess is gone from. It is the notion instead purely vitalistic, purely sexual, purely having to do with our Uncle Siggy calls the libido. Therefore, what does it mean to say that the imperfect is so hot in us? What can it mean to say that the unfinished or the incomplete is so hot in us? When you don't mean too avid or too anything, but when you mean hot on the tail of something, hot on the track of something.
It's what we want, right?
Yeah, what we desire, what we most want, what we have real drive, sexual avidity, libido for, is the imperfect, is the incomplete or the unfinished. Weird thing to say in this of all poems. How do you justify that cognitive effect? There's no question that he's saying that, or that the language, he's having the language say that, or you prefer to talk that way about language since it's fashionable, that the language is saying it for him, which I don't believe for a second. Language won't say anything for you. Language won't write poems. Aren't any inhuman authors? Aren't any processes? Post-structuralism is crap, and so is structuralism. What is he doing here? Forgive my nastiness, but I'm getting awfully tired of all that, especially from the beleaguered fortress one occupies in New Haven. But ordinary evening. But what is he doing there? What can it mean in this poem to say that the incomplete or the unfinished is hot in us, is in fact the desire in us? It doesn't make cognitive sense at first, because it would destroy the poem, wouldn't it?
The cold is there,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
And he's using hot, so he must be, of course, an addition
Sure.
to all the coldness and
Sure.
snow, etc.
What's it do to the word lies? Or to your choice of the two possibilities for the word lies?
Well, it would seem, I always feel you have to read it all the ways that he gives it, but the lies and telling untruths.
You can, since they jar
well,
against one
Well,
another.
the untruths thing would not be the way I would read it. It would be the other way that I would read it in this.
We're contained.
Well,
Well,
it's also,
the real difficulty here is I can't read it any other way now except telling untruths. Just as I can't read so long composed as referring to the pure primordial poem of mankind, as Nietzsche wants to call it. Well, let's hold on to that, because I think there's a real issue there.
And how do you recompose then?
Well, I read that as having to come back to the practice that I've been cultivating as a poet for so long. Yes.
Yeah, I just have a problem with the way some of the words break down
Okay.
towards the end of the poem. It seems to me if you're going to take up this position from the imperfect, so hotness and essential, something once out, once reborn, then you see that stub-born almost is dead-born, and sound and words here refers us back to this whole problem of carnation, incarnation being the physicality of words, flawed words, lawed words, and you have this strange image of a corpse being laid out, which lies in state. And if you look at the way that delight, to me, at least, suggests is totally negative for it. Totally
By now, your flower arrangement is dead.
The flower arrangement is dead, just like the ball, even the Keatsian ball is already this kind of structure.
Sure.
But if you take the D and delight, or desires, then you also have decompose. And this is at the end of a Baudelaire poem, Strmel, I think.
It may be funny
Also has
how
to do with the carnation.
he or his control of language is, I think, perfectly capable of giving you that kind of an effect. But I mean, I can grant all that, at least as possibility. You know, I wouldn't want to quarrel with that as a strong possibility. I still want to address the other question, which I think does take one back to the burden of facticity. Why must one take one reading or the other for the what, or for how to read lies? Why can't you take it both ways if you have to take the poem seriously, whether as reader or as writer? First of all, how serious would it be to take lies as telling untruths? Well, they're equally serious, but you'd have two completely different poems, wouldn't you? If you could end by saying that, note that in this bitterness delight, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds, then you are ending this of all poems by uttering a not unconventional and presumably always heartening, if only you can do it, praise of poetry and of the possibility of writing and reading a poem. I see no way of evading that. But if you are doing that, then you're in an awful lot of trouble, because it seems to me that he has done, whether or not one accepts, some of the darker implications of what was just said over to my right there, as I would partly accept them or not, you have a poem which has really become a kind of perfection of death. You have an art which has realized that it's cost in not less than everything. And then are you really to be told that in this bitterness, the light, since the imperfect is so hot in us, since we want the unfinished, well, it's just grand. We can't settle for these flawed or wind-burned or words. We can't settle for these stillborn, as you say, sounds. And the earlier hope for ghostly demarcations, keener sounds, was just a kind of idealism which is now being dismissed. Then the poem would stand there on the page as an extraordinary act of cognitive dissociation from itself at the close. Then one would say, well, why has the reader been put through all this? And why are you, as a poet, being driven to write so extraordinary a kind of convoluted art? Because it is convoluted. It is in the end neither quite as subtle nor quite as hermetic as Whitman, and yet, without achieving all of the extraordinary nuances of a characteristic, really successful poem or passage by Whitman, it involves the reader in problematics that Whitman can cheerfully dismiss. You're being made to work 10 times as hard to get an effect finally rather less subtle than Whitman can give you, and it would be, I think, wholly destructive of itself. If you admit the other possibility, then what do you get? And as I say, one has to choose, but if one chooses the other...
What is the other now?
Well, the other is to say this. If the what in the third line of the third stanza comes back to one's own practice as a poet, from at least the snowman on, and if the lies in means tells lies to us in, the light lies to us in flawed words and stubborn sounds. Poems are indeed lies against other poems, poems are lies against time, poems are finally, as I think this poem would be saying, lies against themselves. Who is trying to evade an overwhelming American facticity by saying, as he does once at least in prose, the final belief is to believe in a fiction knowing that it is a fiction, and he says the exquisite consolation of knowing that what one believes in is not true. The exquisite consolation of knowing that what one believes in is not true. Now, excuse me, if something that you know you believe in, you also know is, let us not be nice about it and say not true, but a lie, because what is not true is an untrue. It is a lie. It is just not so. Is it really an exquisite consolation, you see? In what sense is it an exquisite consolation? To knowingly believe a lie. If the final belief is to believe in a fiction, what you are then doing is totally undermining not the notion of fiction, of course, but the notion of belief. Well, what are you doing here? There would still remain the never-resting mind. So that one would want to escape, come back to what had been so long composed. If you're going back to your own art, if in spite of everything you go back to this impossible attempt to achieve a fresh first idea, this wearisome American sublime quest for a total self-reliance in the face of tradition, what is one escaping? So that one would want to escape. What are you escaping? If you're not escaping the world of artifice now, and you're not going back to that pure primordial poem of mankind, which is the general idea or notion of nature or the day or reality, then what are you escaping? You can only be escaping reality. You can only be escaping nature. You can only be escaping that weather that lies outside your window. You can only be escaping the inverted dome of the sky. How are you doing it? The imperfect is our paradise, which means our paradise is not a very good condition. Our park or our garden, which is what originally a paradise was, our Eden, is imperfectus, incompleted, in the way a carpenter has failed to finish a table, which isn't, nobody wants an unfinished table from a carpenter. If you pay him for a finished one, an ordinary evening in New Haven, Stevens refers to himself as a carpenter and sees the business of putting together a fiction being rather like a carpenter who can't do his work properly or well. Note that in this bitterness, in this imperfection, this brokenness of our paradise, the light, since the imperfect is so hot in us, it's not just our paradise, it's our desire. But what does that mean? If you can say that to have the incomplete or the unfinished is your deepest lust, your deepest desire, your drive, your libido, what are you saying about yourself? It's utterly, yes?
I'm saying that if you finally reach the end of it, there's safety. And isn't he saying that somehow transforming the reality to really be able to transform it and to capture it totally would be death?
Okay, but I would ask you a simple question. In terms of the fiction of a flower arrangement, and presumably of the spear Japanese abstract kind, which is the whole occasion of this poem, could someone who would say of all of us, the imperfect is our paradise, it is the imperfect that is so hot in us, would someone turn to making such an arrangement? Would someone turn to an aesthetic, which would give you the opening stanza of this poem? One would have to say that there is something at variance between these closing statements and the opening operation or trope or figuration or area of concentration of the poem. Whatever those pink and white carnations in that clear water Macmillan ball amount to, they presumably are as far from the flawed nature of words and the stubborn nature of sounds as they can be. They are simpler entities. They are less evilly compounded, but they are also, of course, less vital. Now you insist that it is the vital, with everything about it which is crude, the bats rather than the porcelain, as it were. Therefore, delight, note that in this bitterness, delight, and look at the sense, the motivation, the reason why delight, which is the most traditional, of course, high romantic synonym for what poetry is supposed to give to us. So that this bitterness, delight, is the trope, I think, for poetry in this poem. All right, or for art, call it what you will, lies in the reason why our poems always tell us lies and in flawed words and stubborn sounds is because our deepest desire is for the imperfect. We don't want a finished statement of any kind. We don't want completion, as though the finish or completion would be death and would be the absence of the vitalistic. But there are several difficulties there. And for him to introduce them may well be fatal for the poem. What were you going to say?
Well, there were a couple things. One, that one of the poems that I see him harkening back to too, which you haven't mentioned, in this kind of use of still, one would want more. And then again, there would still remain the never resting. You have an apposition working there. And that, in Bright Star, Keats is working very much off this similar kind of star frozen as spaces in the star realm, and this kind of still to hear your tender taking breath.
But you don't even have to go to that poem. It's already in the Grecian urn, the famous opening of how still unravished bride of quietness, even though the still modifies unravished, not yet, you see, ravished. Therefore, you may yet speak. The paradox of the speaking urn will put you into an actual ravishment, at least of the sense, but obviously it requires to be read as thou still, even though the punctuation is not there, unravished bride of quietness. So the effect is there.
And when I was thinking it, to sort of set Stevens in context, this is like, again, it's called the Poems of Our Climate. I think it's important to see that
the title.
He said a whole, well, this New England, northern snow, white, there is a kind of sense of living in cognition, and much more in the mind, the life of the mind. And you've got a whole set of poems which are polar opposites in Florida, Key West.
What kind of a title is The Poems of Our Climate? It has an American flair to it, doesn't it? You will not find British poems or French poems called The Poems of Our Climate. That's very American. It suggests, in fact, what authors, beyond a doubt, if you have read them, and you have read them to some extent. The United States are themselves the greatest poem. That is, of course, Mr. Walt Whitman in the preface to the 1855 Leaves of Grass. The shores of America, the great Emersonian phrase picked up by "You have led us to the shores of America," again in the 1855. And the United States is itself the greatest poem because climate means what in this title, by the way? And the usage is both Emersonian and Whitmanian. The Poems of Our Climate. Climate means what? Why does one say the Poems of Our Climate?
Well, sort of a state of mind, I mean, it's a sort of ambiance of the
But the word climate means what? The Poems of Our Weather would appear to mean the easy translation of the title, but clime, which is a related word to climate, and is the root word, means what? In this clime, one sees what? C-L-I-M-E. What does that word mean? What? It's a place. It's just a place. It's the place in which you stand. Any particular clime is a particular place. Clime means region. Poems of Our Climate means the weather of a particular region. But what is he playing on there? Let me invoke the figure of Whitman. What is Whitmanian? What is Whitmanian? If you were to contrast, and I sort of put this off, but do it now. Look at the very close. I have the original version here. It doesn't differ that much. Look at the very close song of Myself. And compare the two stanzas, the end of the Poems of Our Climate and Whitman in terms of a climb. What becomes the 52nd section of the poem. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. As usual, Whitman is being terribly subtle. Why is the spotted hawk complaining? Of my gab and my loitering. He swoops by, which means he's coming right at me, and suddenly he sees my God. And he swoops right by me, and he yawps. And the bird comes at him, comes very close, as though it can perch on him. Suddenly he says, my God, this is not a scarecrow. This loafing figure in rags is not a scarecrow. Yawp! Goes right by him. That's what the line means. He complains, he has every right to complain of my gab and my loitering. I am such a loiterer, I'm so much sauntering at my ease that I'm almost a stationary figure. I'm so much in my customary rags that he took me as being a scarecrow. But after all, he's saying he might as well have perched on me, because I am rather like him. I too am not a bit tame. I too am untranslatable, and he's kidding, of course. Untranslatable means what there? To translate means to do what? Here, to carry a cross, which is after all just a word for metaphor. That's what metaphor means. I too am untranslatable. I too am beyond metaphor. I'm as much a reality as the bird is. I sound my barbaric yawp, but that yawp is the startled sound of the bird over the roofs of the world. That is to say, I sort of head at them, but then I don't actually hit into them. I veer off. The last gutter day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any. He doesn't say more true, he says true as any other likeness on the shadowed wilds. Coaxes me to the vapor and the dust. These ought to be death images, including, as it were, the 52nd week or 52nd section of the poem. They aren't. What keeps them from being that? I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. And an extraordinary line, I effuse my flesh in eddies and drifted in lacy drags. He is, in fact, dismantling himself. He is, it's the process of which the tropes say gravity's rainbow, or the extraordinary sad hero of A Cool Million of Nathaniel West, the dismantling of Lemuel Pitkin. Walt is dismantling himself. He is coming apart. He is suffering a sparagmos, but it is a self-sparagmos. He is willing a sparagmos. Instead of dying, he is orphically distributing himself. He is daimonically dividing himself because, as he very well knew, daimon means that process of division. The daimon is always capable of dividing itself. And he says, I'll do different things with different parts of myself. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love, to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. I'll be in the very grass coming up. Don't try to understand, because I transcend. I am untranslatable. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I'll do you good even if you don't understand. I shall be good help to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. And then what burden is he putting on you as the reader? He has done it already, and what he makes, I think, deliberately when he came to understand what he was doing, line 1320, the last line he makes of the previous section. Absolutely brilliant. After saying, who has done his day's work and will soonest be through with his supper, who wishes to walk with me, puts the burden on you. Will you speak before I have gone, before I end this poem? Will you prove already too late, as though I am perpetually early, but you may be too late to catch up with me? And this extraordinary closing trope, failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another, which also obviously means look through the toe point or common places that I've given you in my work. I stop somewhere waiting for you. What's his stance towards you as a poet? His closing stance, his final gesture. Beautifully done. Where is he? Yeah, he's ahead on the road somewhere. You may be too late. You have to catch up to him. But of course, very powerfully and more audaciously even than in the passage we ended with last time, he is daring to echo a great Christian trope, the journey to Emmaus, where the figure who has been walking the road with you, and I think this gets into that strange Whitmanian use of it in Eliot's The Wasteland, the angel who has been walking the road with you, just before he disappears, says, he is not here, he is already risen and gone ahead of you, seek you him in Emmaus, where the statement is of the risen Christ. So there's an already resurrected Whitman at the same time that he gives you an image of Orphic Sparagmos, he is out ahead of you. He is always both earlier than you and later than you. He's always two up on you. As a possible reader, he's always putting an immense burden upon you, but doing it with high good humor, and you can only admire the extraordinary skill of it. He is asserting a power over you which Stevens, as his Phoebe, knows that he cannot claim. Because if you contrast that to the close of his poem, then I think you see something immediately about the problem that Whitman creates for Stevens, who is apparently so different. Note that, and it is poet speaking to reader, and in spite of saying note that, even though it sounds like an academic lecturer who says, look, as a kind of afterthought, after what I'm saying, note that in this bitterness, the light, since the imperfect is so hot in us, and that's a throwaway, so it's the more important line. Since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in, if I'm right, must tell untruths in flawed words and stubborn sounds. How would you contrast that, the closing with many and so? I'm not saying that it's intended to be, somebody else wants the room. I've kept this a little too long. I'm not saying that it is intended to be the exact opposite, but it gives the effect. What's the nature of the opposition rather than the apposition? What is it that Whitman is asserting towards you as reader that Stevens doesn't even wish he could assert anymore? Surely it's something that can be pinned down. Well, certainly the possibility.
That you could all reach an accord.
Well, first of all, the possibility of an accord. Secondly, the possibility that even if we can't reach an accord, there is potential meaning. It's the potential of meaning which is different. Stevens feels that he must play out all the potentials of meaning in the language of his poem and make you choose, and make himself choose, which may be even more important than making you choose. He may be incidental. Whitman is content to believe in enormous, you might say, rhetorical self-confidence, whether or not it's linguistic self-confidence might be another story, and extraordinary confidence in what can only be called his own cognitive sense, and his own powers of cognition, that he can so place himself in regard to you and in regard to history, that the self-reliant stance on the part of poet can be an exemplum for the reader to catch up to. But the only exemplum, I think, that Stevens offers you in the poem, though it's exquisite, it's absolutely exquisite, it is beautifully done. The artistry of it is quite overwhelming, almost Mozartian, as it were. It's dazzling. What he wants you to do is very deft. But it leaves you with sand, I'm afraid. It leaves you with a feeling that meaning has been so underdetermined by the overdetermination, the rhetorical overload of language, that you must be content even with an untruth. You must be content even with a lie. You must be content with, it's perfectly Freudian conclusion, I think. Well, if you say that the imperfect is so hot in us, then I think you're declaring yourself on the side of Freud. You're saying that finally it is the force of desire, both conscious and unconscious, which is going to totally dominate any possibility of meaning. In any case, we go on with Stevens.